So happy Mobility Month, everyone. We're, I guess, halfway through it. Um, if you don't know, May is National Bike Month. So in Charleston, Charleston Moves, we celebrate Mobility Month because we want to be a little more inclusive and get people who, like to walk, like to take the bus. We're celebrating it all. And so usually every year throughout May, we pull together programming to celebrate complete streets. And so thank you all for joining us tonight for West Ashley history, specifically around transportation. And if we haven't met, my name is Katie Zimmerman. I'm the executive director of Charleston Moves, and we're a nonprofit that advocates for safe, connected, and equitable biking, walking, and public transit throughout Charleston County. I want to extend a huge thanks to tonight's event sponsors, which is Austin and Gowder LLC and MUSC Health. And also thank you to our month-long sponsors, Kimley Horn, LeGrand Elabash Real Estate, Lucy Mortgage Corporation, Morrison Yard, Ravencliff Company, and Superior Construction. One of the things that I really hope you all keep in mind tonight, and I know most of you, so I think you probably will. Our community has learned over the years that when transportation is designed for people, for human beings and their activities, our neighborhoods thrive. When human beings are no longer the central focus in transportation planning, that's when we become divided in a lot of different ways. So that's sort of the theme for tonight in learning lessons from West Ashley's past and how we can apply those going forward. To kick off tonight's program, we're going to start with Nick Butler, PhD, the historian in residence for the Charleston County Public Library. As creator and host of the weekly podcast, Charleston Time Machine, Dr. Butler draws attention to a wide variety of underexplored aspects of local history and neglected documentary resources. We're also going to have a Q&A session later in the program after all of our presenters. So as questions come to mind, feel free to type them in the chat, or you can wait until the Q&A portion of tonight's event. So with that being said, let's hope I can get my technology straight and get Nick's presentation going. And Nick, you might have to unmute yourself because I think I muted everybody to start.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody and happy Thursday evening. It's my pleasure to be here with Charleston Moves and all the great people who are concerned about transportation and mobility and human scale travel, which is where I want to start off with. So I've put together a series of images here, and Katie's going to help me to scroll through these. This is a team effort. I want to start off our discussion tonight about the mobility history and kind of the transportation history of the West Ashley area, or St. Andrews Parish, as some people know it, by going back to the very beginning. And so the image that you see on the screen right there is a map published in 1711, commonly called the Crisp map, published in London. And of course, this is not the earliest map of the Charleston and West Ashley area, but it's a very clear map that works for talking about the earliest generations. So European settlers came here in relatively small numbers in the early days, and then became larger numbers, and very quickly outnumbered the Native Americans who were here. But in many cases, it's really hard to prove at the distance of 350 years, but in many cases, the early European settlers and enslaved Africans who came here were probably following the corridors of travel throughout the Low Country that Native Americans had created. And so we know very little about the paths and pathways and what would eventually become known as highways in the early days. So the map that you see on the screen shows Charleston is over to the kind of the bottom right-hand side of that image. And then there's this big field just above the Stono River and a little bit to the left of the Ashley River there. And we this map doesn't show any kind of transportation network, but of course there must have been some. You see a series of names representing settlements, and those settlements would become plantations. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But if Katie will go to the next slide, there's a little bit of animation here. I've drawn in there with the yellow lines what became the earliest pathways in the area we call West Ashley, so west of the Ashley River. So on the far left-hand side of the screen is the road that became known as, well, we call it Bees Ferry Road, but that was originally the Ashley Ferry Road because it terminated at a ferry that was authorized by law at the beginning of the 18th century, right around 1703. And that road went from the Ashley River, where Bees Ferry Road crosses Ashley River Road now. That road went from the ferry all the way to Willtown. And to get to Willtown, which nobody remembers, Willtown on the Edisto River, it's an extinct town. That road that we call Bees Ferry Road very early on had to cross what we call Rantow's Creek and Wallace's Creek. And those bridges at Rantow's and Wallace Bridge and Rantow Bridge that most of us take for granted when we're going on Highway 17 South, those bridges or versions of those bridges have been there for more than 300 years at this point. Those are very ancient pathways. And then perpendicular to that ferry road is the Ashley River Road, which went parallel to the Ashley River and connected the West Ashley area to James Island directly. If you want to connect to Johns Island, you got to go a little bit farther to the west. And so you can see there connecting across Wapoo Creek in one or two places. We don't know exactly when those arteries began, but I wanted to use this map to talk about the very earliest pathways. And speaking of human scale transportation, these are paths that were used by people on foot and people on horseback and people rolling in carts and carriages, carrying goods to and from Charlestown or to and from other plantations. They didn't need very many roads because most people are getting where they need to go by boat. So crossing the Ashley River to get to the capital of South Carolina, Charlestown, most people did that by boat. Getting from Johns Island to James Island, most people would use a boat of any description. So the roads were not the primary arteries of movement throughout the Lowcountry, but that changed as the generations progressed. So Katie will go on to the next screen.
Sorry.
So here is a map that was published in 1915 by Henry A.M. Smith. And all of these maps that I'm showing you, you can find on the internet. They're in the public domain. So just searching for these names that I'm giving you, you can find them at the Charleston County Public Library's South Carolina History Room, and you can find them on the internet. So this is a map compiled in 1915, but it's a compilation of multiple historic maps and property plats from the early days of the West Ashley River. So at the bottom of the screen is the Stono River. At the bottom right side of the map is Charleston and the Ashley River. And you can see that big bend in the Ashley River at the top of the map. The point I wanted to make, we can see a little bit more clearly if we go to the next slide. And that point is that all of this area that we're talking about was private property from the earliest days of the colony of South Carolina until after the Civil War. This is private land being used for agricultural purposes. We call them plantations or farms. Some of them were quite small, some of them were quite large. Some of them were subdivided multiple times. But the point I wanted to make is that this is all private property. So there were very few public roads going through these. And what human beings would have used, what the people living on these plantations would have used were corridors that connected different parts of the plantation and one plantation to the next. And the majority of the people using those footways would have been enslaved people who formed the majority of the population west of the Ashley until the 20th century. So if we're talking about the history and traditions of mobility and moving around west of the Ashley, we have to take into account not just the public roads, but also the private pathways that the inhabitants of this area would have used over the generations. And think about why they would have traveled. You know, if the majority of the population is enslaved, then why would they want to use a road? Well, to get from market to or from market, to go on errands for the people who legally own them. And you have to remember that in all of those cases, the mobility and traffic, the movement of enslaved people was always restricted by law, and they were always under surveillance. So the government is discouraging people from moving. And I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of talking about the history of enslaved movements, but just keep in mind that these roads are being used by really just a minority of the population. The public roads are being used mostly by white males who are traveling to and from Charlestown, or enslaved men and women who are running errands for their masters. And that's the history, the deep history of this area. And I want you to just keep that in mind when we're talking about the landscape, because this was a populated landscape being used for agricultural purposes and not commercial purposes. There wasn't a lot of travel. And what travel there was mostly on foot or on horseback. So we'll go to the next screen, Katie. And here's another map also compiled by Henry Smith in the early 20th century, showing that area that's just a little bit north of our focus tonight, the area around Bees Ferry Road, where it intersects with Ashley River Road. You can see at the top of the screen, Drayton Hall Plantation. I just wanted to underscore that idea that these are just acres and acres and acres of plantations and people who are not traveling for recreation and not traveling to get to and from work. They're working where they are and moving around on foot or on horseback for most of the history of this area. Next slide, Katie. So continuing into the 20th, along in the 18th century, I want to zoom in on this big map of South Carolina and Georgia published in 1757. Keep going, Katie. And in this highlight of this larger 1757 map, we see right in the center, St. Andrew's Parish. Just south is St. John's Parish, John's Island. St. Paul's Parish is that area to the west or to the left, you know, where Ravenel is and St. Paul's Fire Department. So within St. Andrew's Parish in this 1757 map, you can see those dashed lines represent the paths that people are using. One more click, Katie. Should set in motion some transportation arrows there, showing the customary route. If you're coming from the west, you're taking that road to Charlestown and crossing Rantal's Bridge and Wallace Bridge and going along the ferry road all the way to Ashley Ferry, and then connecting to Dorchester Road and going to Charlestown. Or if you need to go to John's Island, or James Island, you can see the dotted lines connecting people there. So bear in mind, Savannah Highway does not exist. There's no reason for Savannah Highway to exist because this area is so lightly traveled. Next slide. Moving right along, I wanted to share with you this 1779 map. General Augustine Prevost brought the British Army to attack Charleston in the spring of 1779. And they marched from Savannah to Charleston and looked at the city for a couple of days and then turned around and went home. So Katie will press the button. We'll go on to the next slide. And we're going to zoom in even closer on that area of West Ashley. One more slide. And you'll see on the left side of the screen, Rantal's Bridge. And on the right side of the screen is Charlestown on the Ashley River. And Katie, you can click one more time and set in motion that animation. So the British Army followed that path that everyone else did across Rantal's Bridge, up the ferry road that we call Bees Ferry, crossed at Ashley Ferry, went to the Quarter House on Dorchester Road, and then turned down to Charleston. And one more click, Katie. When they evacuated, the British Army looked at Charleston and decided to evacuate. They crossed through the West Ashley area and went over to James Island and then on to Johns Island and back towards Savannah. So the point is they were following the tried and true, very limited pathways through the West Ashley area. Next slide. Okay, we're getting into the 19th century, and the architect Robert Mills published this Atlas of South Carolina in 1825. The Charleston district here that you're seeing on the screen was actually surveyed earlier than 1825, and that it reflects the roads that existed in the early 1820s. So Katie will go on to the next slide, which zooms in on our portion of West Ashley. We see a few topographical figures here and a few more roads. And if we zoom in one more time, Katie, we'll see the predominant roads west of the Ashley. And by now, this should be familiar. On the left side of the screen is Rantall's Bridge, and on the right side of the screen is good old Charlestown. And Katie, give us one more click. And I've circled the principal crossing points. So again, the West Ashley area is surrounded by water. And for many generations, people were using those waterways for transportation. But by the time we get to the 19th century, early 19th century, there are more roads now and making it easier for people in horse-drawn carriages and carts to move to the commercial center in Charlestown and to move through the plantation landscape on that bridge road. Katie, click one more time, and I've circled the bridge road, which you and I we call that Savannah Highway. That's part of Highway 17. But what that bridge road that you haven't seen on the previous maps is, it's a toll road 9 miles in length that was created in the early 19th century. So the Charleston Bridge Company, the first bridge built over there where the lower circle is on the right-hand corner, that bridge company, chartered in 1809, 1810, promised the state it would build a toll road from Rantall's Bridge to the new bridge. And so that's a 9-mile stretch that the state of South Carolina, in their articles of incorporation, said that the bridge company had to build in as straight a line as possible. And that's why Savannah Highway is that long 9-mile stretch of boring road, just with no exciting curves or hills or anything. That was a toll road that opened on the 1st of August, 1811, and we're still using it today, almost 211 years later. And that bridge road was the beginning of a new era of transportation across the West Ashley area, just before the advent of the railroads. And that's my cue to hand the baton off to Charlie Smith and to start talking about the beginning of the railroads and how that different mode of transportation influenced different corridors and pathways that people were using to go through this area. So over to you, Charlie.
Thank you, Nick. And can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to bring you a little bit forward into the 19th century and talk about how things began to change then. Of course, as Nick was saying, that the earliest public transportation links between what we know as West Ashley and the areas like the peninsula and James Island and Johns Island were by ferries along the Ashley River and the Stono, and those few roadways that later developed along the paths to the settlements from, particularly in the areas that are closer into the city, from the Old Town area and extending up the west side of the Ashley River, and southeasterly from the Old Town area down toward James Island, passing through the area that we know today as DuPont. And that's the community that I want to talk a little bit about today. What we know today as the Wapoo Road began not far from Old Town, passing through Tiger Swamp and Gaddis Hall, and continuing along the Wapoo Causeway near what's now Capri Island, Edgewater Park. It continued along Wapoo Creek and across Elliott Cut and across Wapoo Creek to what we know as the River Road area on James Island now, and then out to Saul Legree and to Fort Johnson. This Wapoo Road and River Road corridor was pretty much the main street area of the closer in section of West Ashley that we know today. And you'll see, I wanted to, before we go to the next slide on this, when we think of these roadway links, we think of today, we think of the connections directly into downtown. And we kind of think about that area around the Holiday Inn, around the Holiday Inn on the West Ashley side, and on the Spring Street corridor downtown. But as Nick was saying, that didn't exist before the 1810 bridge opened. So as Nick was telling you, this is where the Turnpike Road that was authorized with the construction of the bridge by the legislature in 1808. That bridge was constructed, but that was 139 years into Charleston history before that happened. This is an article that came out of a Pendleton, South Carolina weekly newspaper that mentions Mr. Mills. And I've done a good bit of research on this, and it does turn out that this is Robert Mills that they refer to. But in this little article, they credit him not only with the Ashley River Bridge, but with the first bridge over the Potomac in Washington. And they also give this great description of the details of the bridge. And you'll note in this article that this bridge had 2 sidewalks lighted by 40 lamps. So in 1810, when this opened, the pedestrians were able to cross both day and night. So this is an interesting thing, not only to have that connection into downtown, but to have an emphasis on pedestrian connection and being able to light that at night. So this was quite an engineering feat to do this. And it was also, I think, the longest bridge in the South at the time. We'll switch over to the slide that Nick showed a few minutes ago. I've added one thing. This is, again, the H.A.M. Smith 1915 composite plat showing the Ashley River plantations. But if you'll see that line that goes from the left up to the right there, I've added that line because we're going to talk in a little bit about the Seaboard Airline Railway and the Atlantic Coastline Railway, which cross at DuPont that we mentioned earlier. And then, of course, you see US 17 marked there, which had started out as that Turnpike Road. The DuPont community, if most of you are familiar with that, is the area kind of around today where we have Wapu Road and Savannah Highway intersecting. The community was named for the family of Caroline Sophia Geddes DuPont, and she was the granddaughter of Governor John Geddes and the wife of William Wilfred DuPont. Caroline died, unfortunately, in her late 20s in 1870, and her property passed to her husband and then later to her son, Gilbert. So that's where DuPont actually gets its name from. But it became such an important crossroads in the community because in September of 1860, the Charleston and Savannah Railway began service between its Charleston terminus, which was near the current Porter-Gaud School area, and the city of Savannah. And passengers and freight were brought from downtown across to the west side of the Ashley River to board the train. And we can switch to the next slide if you like. I, of course, didn't have too much photographic evidence of early Ashley River ferries, but this is a photograph of an Ashley River ferry that was taken in about 1918. And I just think it's really interesting because it's not only an Ashley River ferry, but it shows a really early gas-powered or naphtha powered boat in the foreground. And it's pulling a ferry that's loaded with automobiles and pedestrians. So again, we've never left pedestrians out. And we're 100 years on from the first Ashley River Bridge, and here we are with a ferry, and we're still taking care of pedestrians. So it's an important part of having a healthy community all the way through history. It's been this way. Another interesting point you might note on this photograph, if you look up in the upper left, you'll notice a naval vessel going out of the harbor. So we know that this is probably right around the foot of Broad Street from the orientation of where that vessel is. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known where it was. But that's probably about the only place on the Ashley River that vessel would have been. But getting back to DuPont, in 1878, 18 years after the railroad first opened, the plant system became the successors of the Charleston and Savannah Railway, and they didn't want to use the end of the line up near Portergaud School anymore. And then actually earlier on, there had been discussions about routing that line elsewhere before the line was ever built. But the plant system actually built what became the Ashley River Railroad, and it linked the area near Main Road along what's now Bees Ferry and out across the Ashley, which allowed the main line coming from Savannah on the plant system railroad to cross the Ashley River near Bees Ferry and come into the peninsula of Charleston near what's now Bennett Yard. So that's when you see that occurring. But after the 1878 portion of the Charleston and Savannah Railroad that ran through DuPont was no longer part of the main line, it became a spur line. And this continued to be important because along that spur line were 14 private produce sheds that serviced truck farms all along that route. And this becomes very important to the later history of the 19th century for the West Ashley area because we had so many truck farms here. And Katie, if you could, were we able to do anything? This slide is a little difficult to see because it's a really long linen blueprint, white line on linen blueprint. But there are 14, the ACL line is actually running north-south, but there are actually 14 stations that run from this Y here back toward the Ashley River. And we just weren't able to get this oriented really well. But the Y that comes off to the right there, that's actually the plant system line that was put in 1878 that became the Ashley River Railroad. So, and thanks to Buddy Hill for that too. I don't know if you're familiar with the Railroad Historical Society here, but Buddy Hill has been really helpful in getting some details about what some of these landmarks were over the years. But in 1917, the Seaboard Airline Railroad came into Charleston and it crossed what had become known as the Atlantic Coastline Croghan Spur, which is the piece that you're looking at here. The railroads intersected at DuPont, and that's why sometimes you hear DuPont referred to as DuPont Crossing, because that was the actual crossing of the two railroad lines. This created an interesting, well, kind of a problem. But Katie, if you'll move to the next slide. When you have an intersection of railroads, you have to switch back and forth as the trains come and go. And thanks to David Childress, we had the opportunity to document this little building, which was actually the interlocking tower, which was used to house the switch that moved the tracks back and forth, shifting the ability of the trains to pass over each other. So this was a Seaboard Airline Railway 1917 building that sat near that intersection. And if you look really closely to the left of the door there on the siding, you'll see a piece of sheet metal, and that's covering a hole where there was an electronic lock. And when the Atlantic Coastline trains would come up to the SAL, which was primary, they had to stop. And the engineer would have to get out, or some employee would have to get out, walk over to this building, let themselves in, lock the door behind them, and shift the trackage so that the train could pass over the Seaboard Airline Railway. They could not get out of that building until they switched that switch back. So that's why that electronic lock was on the door, so that they wouldn't forget to switch it back. But this building was removed from the right of way and became a garden shed in the backyard of a neighbor here. Some of you may know David Childress. And we tried our best to save it, but unfortunately, as good as it looks on the inside, it was totally riddled with termites on the inside. And as soon as we tried to move it, it fell over. So we were glad to have photographs of it, but this is the interlocking tower from DuPont Crossing. In 1941, the 14 individual truck farm sheds that we mentioned along that Atlantic Coastline Spur were consolidated into a single produce shed, which most of us knew as the Charleston County Market, which was located on Wapu Road, just across, very close to the Savannah Highway intersection on the Seaboard Airline track. And if you could switch to that one for us, Katie, the next one. This was the old shed. There had been some additions on the front of that before it was demolished a few years ago. This is an early photograph of the Charleston shed taken by Luther Boodle, who's Ina Boodle's cousin, did a lot of photography in the area. And if you were in this area and you wanted to hitch a ride into downtown from the DuPont area or pretty much anywhere within walking distance, you would flag the Seaboard Airline train as it passed through DuPont, and you could catch that train and go into the Grove Street station over by the Citadel near Rutledge Avenue for a quarter. So once again, we've got connectivity through West Ashley, but pedestrians again are still being taken care of. You could still catch that train and get into downtown. That Seaboard Airline Railway ceased passenger service on this track about 1956, and the Atlantic Coastline abandoned the Croghan Spur about 1980. The former Atlantic Coastline Railroad right-of-way, parallel to Savannah Highway, of course, is now the West Ashley Greenway, and the former Seaboard Airline Railway right-of-way from DuPont to Maryville is now the Maryville Bikeway. But historically, all of these modes of transportation were state-of-the-art for their time, but pedestrians were always included, and that's what's so important about this conversation tonight, and to remember going forward. And thank you, and I'll hand it back to Katie.
Thanks, Charlie. And I was remiss in not introducing you to the group. Anybody who doesn't know Charlie, he is a big community advocate. He did a lot of work around this vegetable shed that we are looking at, trying to protect it. He's a community advocate and independent real estate professional who obviously loves exploring local history. And he also served 8 years on the Charleston County Planning Commission and is currently on the West Ashley Revitalization Commission. So if you ever tune into those meetings, you'll see Charlie. And then next we have Donna Jacobs, a retired biomedical researcher who loves local history. Her published books, Burns Downs and West Ashley, are the products of her exploration into how St. Andrews Parish changed from an agrarian society to the suburb of West Ashley. So Donna, you are up.
Well, thank you, Katie. And again, thanks to Charleston Moves for this great opportunity for us to explore West Ashley history. Nick and Charlie have given y'all a great perspective on how people move throughout parish and how DuPont Crossing is not only the physical center of the parish, but was a hub for transportation. Transportation infrastructure is critical to a community. Whether a community is beginning or rebuilding, access provided by infrastructure is usually a boring but necessary first step. However, infrastructure, depending on how it's planned, can create connectivity or it can divide a community. I've gone back a little bit in history and picked a window of time that illustrates some aspects of connectivity, mobility, and diversity in St. Andrews Parish, West Ashley. And I'd like to open by quoting from this 1888 newspaper article. "The rebuilding of the bridge over the Ashley River was a great thing for Charleston," suggested Brown. "Now you're on the right line," said the reporter. "It's been done more to develop the rich truck lands of St. Andrews than any other cause that is now operating to make them so valuable. But it was a great thing for the poor people as well as their land-owning neighbors. Now for a small toll, a man can take his wife and children out for a drive or a walk into the country. The bridge is a great institution for all classes of people in Charleston." Thus, we have this concept of Pleasure Grove that I want to focus on, and it sounds so intriguing and fun. So let's go exploring. But first, I'm going to give you a little disclaimer. I'm going to be quoting heavily from newspapers during this time because the flowery language is just, you can't repeat it. You just got to read it. But first, a little context. So if you'll give me my second slide, Katie. For St. Andrew's Parish to really thrive again in the post-Civil War era, it needed to be connected back to the peninsula. The decision to rebuild the bridge that had been burned during the war created another turning point in St. Andrew's Parish history. The bridge company contracted with the Keystone Bridge Company of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in November of 1884 for the, quote, speedy and complete construction of a bridge across the Ashley River. The first pile was driven on the 15th of January in 1885, and the structure, complete in every aspect, was turned over to the company on 28 January of 1886, according to an article that appeared in a February 9, 1886 edition of the News and Courier. For a mere nickel, a foot passenger could walk across the bridge. Tolls varied from 10 to 25 cents, depending on how many animals were with the carriage or how many animals you had or what type of animals were. So we had a diversity of uses, even evident in these days based on a toll structure. In January of 1886, an article ran in the News and Courier that talked about the new line of communication between Charleston and St. Andrew's Parish and some of the benefits that would result from the construction of the bridge, and emphatically stated, quote, this marks the completion of one of the most important and valuable works that has been undertaken in Charleston since the close of the war. Upon opening, over 2,000 people walked over this bridge. That kind of reminds you of what we did when we opened the Ravenel Bridge. One of the pleasantest promenades that a person can take. By February of that same year, St. Andrew's Parish was technically being marketed. Today we might call this ecotourism. The response to a question posed to the editor of the News and Courier about the best time to visit the city included this statement, quote, a very pleasant drive is also offered by the recent opening of the new bridge over the Ashley River, the approach to which is over a smooth stone block roadway. The bridge leads over into Ashley Parish, which is in time destined to become an important section of Charleston. What a nice prediction for West Ashley. Field, Forest, and Fancy was the title of the article that ran in May of 1886 in the News and Courier. 2 of the 8 columns that appeared on page 8 were dedicated to the details seen by a reporter who took a, quote, ride through a romantic and poetic parish, unquote. He writes, a reporter well equipped for a tour of exploration through a land whose praises were being sung by all who have been fortunate enough to have made the grand tour of discovery, set out on his travels on Saturday morning last. Contrary to the prevailing fashion of Charleston travelers across the bridge, the Pioneer Corps set out in the early morning for a long drive through the classic avenues of the parish. The reporter was obviously smitten with his tour as he continued at great length with detailed, romantic, flowery, and delightful description of the parish. So if I may have the 3rd slide, please. In the June 6, 1887 issue of the News and Courier, an ad like the one shown here ran that described pleasure resorts. The new hall and grove in St. Andrews just over the bridge is all ready for picnics, shady groves, good playgrounds, excellent water, all the conveniences. And the following advantages over other places. The grove and hall are free. The tolls are low. You can go any time of day and you can leave any time. Enterprise cars carry you to the gate of the bridge at low rates of fare. Thus, Pleasure Grove became a popular destination and many events were documented in the paper. Quote, to spend a day at Pleasure Grove amid the beautiful scenery and shaded by the moss-covered and towering oaks is indeed a rare pleasure to picnic parties. After a cool and invigorating walk across the broad waters of the Ashley, at the end of which the pleasure seekers find themselves in a shady grove, where a large and commodious hall is at their disposal. Another quote, it would be impossible to describe in the limits of one newspaper article the attractions of the El Dorado, which has been opened up by the rebuilding of the bridge over the Ashley River. The attractions of Pleasure Grove are already known. The bridge itself is a pleasant resort to the residents of the upper wards, equal to the famous Battery and White Point Gardens. How about that? In 1888, the annual picnic of a club with the initials HUT, which I've never found what that means, but it was one of the most exclusive and select of the social organizations of the Charleston area, held an annual picnic at Pleasure Grove. In 1889, The colored people of the city and vicinity held a revival meeting here. In June 1892 was the date of the 4th annual picnic of the Jessamine Social Club. On the 4th of July in 1888, the emancipated citizens enjoying themselves in the woods, according to the headline that read in the News and Courier. The article went on to say, and I quote, Mr. T.W. Hughes, who holds the keys of the city, of the gates through which so many people pass into the lands of St. Andrews, was very busy all day yesterday with a throng of colored folks who usually have their gala day on the blessed 4th under the oaks of Pleasure Grove. The colored people had a picnic in the old and new sense of the phrase. It cost very little to get into the fields, and with Pleasure Grove and Pleasure Hall and the music and the military, they had the day almost entirely to themselves. So if I can have the next slide, please. Pleasure Grove was the site of tilts or jousting contests of the Charleston Light Dragoons. This was a prominent militia organization of Charleston's economic and social elite. These tilts were meticulously recorded in journals that are part of the Dragoons' archives held at the South Carolina Historical Society. There were monthly tilts during the years spanning from 1888 through 1892, with the annual tilt seeing many participants and awards. Even a box of sugar plums were awarded one year to a Mr. T.B. Anderson, who in the management of his charger and his dexterity in the manipulation of his saber certainly deserved both great commendations as well as those sugar plums. In addition to promenading, picnicking, and jousting, the idea of cycling from peninsular Charleston to the country across the Ashley River was also gathering momentum. Cycling adventures to the parish organized by the various wheelman groups were regularly featured in the newspaper. And here's a few examples. A headline, a picnic on wheels. Mr. Bucasey will entertain his pupils in St. Andrews, read the April 20th, 1896 headline in the Evening Post. Quote, the great bicycle picnic, which Mr. L.W. Bucasey has prepared for his bicycle pupils and friends, will take place tomorrow. The cyclists will assemble at 9:30 a.m. at the Hibernian Hill and will ride in a body across the bridge into St. Andrews Parish, Pleasure Grove, where the jessamine twines and the violet perfumes the air with its gracious fragrance, while riders of the silent steed disport themselves on the soft green carpet of velvety moss. This is the first picnic a la cycle given in this part of the country, and aside from its other delightful features, its novelty will attract a large group of cyclists, and the merry clang of the bell will wake the echoes of the forest with its lively music. Don't we all want to be on that ride? A Wheelman's Retreat, a clubhouse in St. Andrews Parish for the cyclists, is an intriguing headline from the January 4th, 1897 edition of the News and Courier. The Cabin Cycle Club is an organization recently formed among the most prominent wheelmen of Charleston. The club has erected a house in St. Andrews Parish at which the members may rest and refresh themselves on their runs into the country. Another headline, The Road a Wheel, a ride with Charleston cyclists shall take, appeared in the February 1898 edition of the News and Courier. Quote, the bicycle question is a peculiar one, continues with a discussion on the fad of cycling, and ends with a list of sites to tour in St. Andrews Parish. Elliott's Cut, the view at the Stono River, the Shell Road, Ashleyville, Maryville, the Frost Place, paths lined with proud old oaks, the Legree Place, and Ghost Island were some of the sites listed. And who could resist an adventure to a place with a name like Ghost Island? This marketing of St. Andrews Parish continued for many years. In 1906, Picnics at Pleasure Grove listed 7 churches, including Star Gospel Mission, where they hosted a picnic of 300 to 400 people. In addition, if I may have the 5th slide, I might have skipped a slide there. No, there it is. In addition to all the fun that this dance hall showed during this time, the business of suburban development was beginning. The plat for Maryville, Charleston Company, Section 1, 2, and 3 were registered with Berkeley County in 1885. A small announcement ran in the February 1886 edition of the News and Courier. Ashley River Bridge now open. Purchasers of lots are notified they can now cross Ashley Bridge. I will be at Hillsborough each afternoon at 3 o'clock. Building lots are 50-foot front, 100-foot deep, at $5 cash and $5 a year for 4 years. No charge for paper. Complete plats now ready at 36 Broad, W.M. Taft, unquote. And with that little tidbit, I'm going to hand it back to Katie to introduce Diane Hamilton for our next perspective on this.
I love it. Thank you so much, Donna. So last but certainly not least is Diane Hamilton. She's a lifelong resident of Maryville in Charleston and a retired educator with a concentration on history. She served as Maryville-Ashleyville Neighborhood Association president for 10 years. And here's your first slide, Diane. Might be muted. Did we lose Diane?
No, it helps.
Oh, good.
It helps. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate in this very informative session. And I was saying we really could stop right here, but I will continue. Connection and controversy. From the beginning, connectivity and controversy surrounded the construction of Highway 614, known as the New Road and today as St. Andrews Boulevard. The two C's continues today. First, I will provide a little overview, then describe the specific impact on the Maryville-Asheville community. The slide you're looking at now, before the charter of the town of Maryville was revoked in May of 1936, stories were told about whites from the peninsula establishing cycling clubs in the town of Maryville, adding to what Donna just started, and riding through the area to Somerville. This particular article was posted in the Charleston Evening Post, December 7th, 1896, and it reported a great run. The TC Cycle Club makes a fast trip to Somerville, which took 2 hours and 5 minutes. After dinner, they took 2 hours and 15 minutes to return to Charleston. Slide 2. This is a bit difficult to read, so let's move to slide 3 where I retyped it. The Evening Post, March 15th of 1897, page 5, reports on improvements to the TC Club in Maryville. RWB, Red, White, and Blue Cycle Club, according to the Evening Post, December 8th, 1896, had been recently organized and elected officers. However, by 1898, the club decided to move from Maryville to the Collins house they had acquired on Rutledge Avenue. Mrs. Marguerite Julia Richardson, who was one of the oldest members of the community I interviewed and included in my book, shared stories about how she and her mother would walk via Moreland and from Ashleyville via Moreland and across the bridge to Broad Street to pay their property taxes. Next slide. Churches on the peninsula would run ads such as this one in the newspaper, inviting people to travel to Invincible Park on Main Street in the town of Maryville for picnics. Next slide. This map shows how the area looked or appeared in 1918 and prior to the construction of St. Andrews Boulevard. I'm sorry I don't have the nice arrows that Nick had. This is a lesson. I will learn this for the next time. I will have them. But if you look to the bottom left, you will see Savannah Highway. And of course, I've just learned, when you think you know all the names for these roads, here comes another one. So now I have to add Bridge Road to the list of Shell Road, Highway 17, and Savannah Highway. But that is the road. If you move slightly parallel, moving up, you will actually see Magnolia Road. And this road actually goes through, you see where Albemarle, the word Albemarle is located? That is the present day Maryville area. It is encompassed with, it includes 8 streets. And you can also see the Seaboard Air Railroad that travels through there between streets 1st and 2nd. The names of those streets today are Armstrong and Brody. And the railroad travels all the way across, and you see the next cluster of settlements by the words Old Town. And of course, the seaboard line crosses the Ashley River and comes out near the Citadel, traveling towards Hampton Park. Again, there's no St. Andrews Boulevard in place because it does not exist at this particular point in time. Okay, the next slide. This is another map, and you could kind of see visually the new highway, which was another name for St. Andrews Boulevard, or Highway 614. It's 100 feet in length, and you could see how it comes out and branches through. Also coming down, you can see Magnolia Road as it comes through the area and then joins in as it curves with that little Y section there. And this map, or this plat rather, was created in 1944. It was based on railroad maps and also a map of Maryville from 1929. Let's see. An early controversy reported in the Charleston Evening Post, August 16th and 18th of 1945, concerned work preparatory to paving this 2.6 miles of Highway 61 from the point just west of the Ashley River Bridge to connect with Highway 614, St. Andrews Boulevard near Maryville. Was its position on the list for pavement advanced to benefit I.D. Peak, the State Highway Department Commissioner of the 9th Judicial Circuit and President of the West Charleston Corporation, who owned land in the area? State Senator Oliver T. Wallace believed that other roads where homes were located should take priority. Mr. Peak countered by stating that the grading of the road was on the list prior to his becoming a commissioner, and noted that Highway 614 was a part of the interstate system and was needed to alleviate the increased traffic on existing main roads. E.W. Hernandez of 10 Rosedale Drive in Avondale wrote a letter to the editor of the Charleston Evening Post, March 11, 1974, page 12, about, and I quote, being disturbed over the continual decline in the general appearance of the boulevard since it was zoned for office use a few years ago. Once beautifully planted yards are now paved parking areas with a conglomeration of signs. The late 1990s and early 2000s, Mr. Leonard Higgins, who was born in the former town of Maryville, a teacher, coach, principal, and president of the Maryville-Asheville Neighborhood Association, led a 6-year community effort to successfully remove an adult bookstore from 904 St. Andrews Boulevard at Sycamore Avenue. Today, the controversy revolves around solutions to safely crossing the road and not impact the 40,000 plus cars using the road, some as a pass-through. Today, it is not safe to cross this highway on foot or bicycle. A number of persons have been injured while attempting to do so, even at the traffic light at St. Andrews Boulevard and Sycamore. I live on the Maryville side and will only cross in my car at the traffic light. Because of the lack of a safe way to cross St. Andrews Boulevard at the bikeway, this treasure is not being fully utilized. This issue requires a solution if we are going to address a point the citizens made in creating Plan West Ashley, which advocated for connectivity between neighborhoods. I would like to now ask the question, what was the impact of the construction of this new road on the Maryville-Ashleyville community? The obvious fact is that people who owned property in the path of the road lost their land. Emmanuel AME Church on Fifth Avenue, which was built in 1885, lost some of its property. I remember Mrs. Richardson during my interview with her named some of the families, and unfortunately I don't remember and I didn't write them all down, who actually owned property which would be in the middle of the highway at this point in time. Since the school, Frederick Deming Jr. Industrial School for Blacks, was located on Fifth Avenue near the site of the former Lord Proprietor's plantation, some children had to walk across a highway now to get to school. In the early 1950s, I admit it, I was one of those children. I attended Deming School, as we called it, for grades 1, 2, and 3. Then parents felt secure in letting their small children cross the road alone due to limited traffic, as well as their need to get to their jobs. My stay-at-home mom still felt comfortable allowing her 5-year-old to navigate her way to school each day. By the time the road was widened in the mid-50s, however, the school had been closed and the children were bused to Wallace Consolidated School about 1.5 miles away. As a small child, I remember my mother and father on Sunday afternoons walk across that highway to attend society meetings, which were held in churches and our halls east of St. Andrews Boulevard. These organizations provided financial and emotional support during times of illness or death in the family. In addition, they provided opportunities for socialization. People crossed the highway each day to go to work on the Ravenel, Bailey, and Miller farms, visit family and friends, as well as to shop at Grant Village Store on the Ashleyville side, which was owned by one of the Black mayors of the town, or Wigger Store, which was owned by persons of German descent on the Maryville side. Part of that family lived behind the store. With several churches located now on each side of the highway, people crossed the highway to attend their church services. The afternoon and evening services were attended by persons from various denominations as they supported each other with their programs. The result of the highway having physically divided our community was that people adapted, and despite the physical division, continued to feel and operate as one community. Next slide. In 1940, South Carolina Power Company provided public transportation in the form of 27 passenger buses, which traveled through the neighborhood in order to get from the peninsula to points beyond Maryville, Asheville. Seating on the bus was negotiated with whites seated from the front to midway and blacks seated in the rear. The demand for this service among all demographics was so great that by 1942, 45 passenger buses, this is the one that you're seeing here, were implemented. An example of this is the one that's headed to Pierpoint. On the Maryville side, which encompassed 8 streets, the Ashley River and Pierpoint buses ran on a regular basis through the center of the community. Next slide. The buses did not go into the Ashleyville side, but stops were located along St. Andrews Boulevard. I wanted you to see the back of the bus as well. Many times, persons on the Asheville side would walk across St. Andrews Boulevard and come to Magnolia Road to catch the bus. In spite of restrictions placed on citizens for social interactions between different groups of people, it was very common for Blacks and whites to have polite conversations while they waited for the bus. My dad and I rode the bus every Saturday morning to Rodenberg on Cannon Street, and when they relocated to Avondale on Savannah Highway to purchase our weekly groceries. Many families, in addition to using bicycles, used the public buses to have access to a greater variety of stores on the peninsula, such as Edwards, 5 and Dime on King Street, purchase appliances from Sears on Calhoun Street, or to buy clothing from Kerrison and Belk department stores. St. Andrews Boulevard and the addition of the buses made it easier for families and friends to keep in touch. In addition, some of the children from the community were able to switch from riding their bicycles to using the buses to attend schools on the peninsula, such as Avery and Burke, to get their high school diplomas, since the schools in West Ashley did not have the 12th grade prior to the mid-50s. In conclusion, the construction of St. Andrews Boulevard negatively impacted the community with loss of property in the beginning, division of all neighborhoods along its path, and created safety and division issues for the present. It also created an identity issue for some persons. Are we just an area to pass through quickly? Or is this a great place to settle down, enjoy life, and call home? On the positive side, it did increase the population of West Ashley, provided greater interaction between those who lived and worked in West Ashley and the peninsula, supported business development on both sides, and expanded employment opportunities for all. I thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, I'd forgotten about the video store, the adult bookstore fight. Forgot all about that. That was wonderful, y'all. Thank you so much. I learned so much. I'm looking at the chat to see, and it looks like, yes, you all, everybody needs to go look up Charleston Time Machine on the Charleston County Public Library website. That's Nick's podcast, and it's spectacular. So yes, go check that out. He's got everything you can think of in it. And Diane, do you want to tell folks how they can buy your book that just came out?
Thank you so much. This is the new book. It's entitled Maryville, The Audacity of a People. It is now available by the publisher immediately. You can place your order. You can also pre-order on Amazon, and it'll be available June 21st. And on next week, I should be getting in a shipment. So if someone would like it earlier than that, just give me a call. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
All of this trying to answer a question. What did my neighborhood look like prior to the construction of St. Andrews Boulevard? And this is the answer.
That's one. And this sort of, for anybody who is interested in continuing to get involved with some of the questions that Diane and others brought up, what do we want our community to look like in West Ashley? How do we want these streets to function with land uses and with people? What's the vision? And Plan West Ashley was, that's a plan that was passed by City Council, a lot of citizen involvement, but how does that actually look on the ground? If you all are interested in getting involved with some of our advocacy work to, obviously the well-known one is the new Ashley River Bicycle and Pedestrian Bridge, and the comment period from the city is still open for that. They're just looking for your input. It doesn't mean the project is being questioned. It's just part of the process. But that, if you go to ashleyrivercrossing.com, the public comment from the city's side of things is still open until Monday, I think. So let them know what you want to see. But there's plenty of others. As Diane mentioned, we want to see a safe crossing across St. Andrews Boulevard at the Maryville Bikeway entrance. And that's been a political struggle and a little bit of an engineering struggle, but mostly political. And that's something that we want to continue to place pressure to get done. There's also throughout West Ashley, we want to see the North Bridge crossing be safe for people biking and walking, especially once the region gets our first spine of low country rapid transit. That's not going to be in West Ashley, but if we can safely cross our bridges on bike and foot to get to those stations, then rapid transit benefits us even more. Alongside the Ashley River Bridge, the new one, there's a couple of intersections that are going to be improved as well along the Greenway. And those are important to note at where the Greenway intersects Folly Road and also where it intersects Wapoo Road, which are both very hairy crossings. The money is going to improve those as well. But again, making sure you all are weighing in on that and letting the city know what you want to see. And there are tons of others as well. There's a project that's been funded for a long time to connect the bikeway and the Greenway at Wapoo Road and Highway 17. the bridge road, did I get, that hopefully we'll get an update on that soon, but that's just sort of, in limbo and folks need to speak up. But anyway, I'll quit babbling, but certainly there's plenty of opportunities for you all to have your sort of people power get into play in West Ashley. Donna, yes, sorry.
I noticed in the chat somebody was questioning my term Hibernian Hill. Now, okay, it's a couple of things. It could be a typo from the newspaper and they meant Hibernian Hall, but I've been working extensively as a planning commissioner with the city on our city plan with settlement communities, and a lot of them are called, and neighborhoods are called Silver Hill, Garden Hill. We heard of Sunday Hill. We've heard of the Hill. We've heard of Jenkins Hill. And my comment has always been during this exploration is, where are these hills exactly? Well, I thought we were the Low Country. So it's a valid question. So I can't know for sure if it's a typographical error in the newspaper or if there really was a little area called Hibernian Hill based on these references to hills that we're finding as we work on the settlement community identification around the area. Maybe Nick has a little perspective on that usage of term because a lot of people are using that term.
Well, and I think you're right about how it's kind of a cultural term, but also Hillsborough Plantation, which somebody, I think it might've been Charlie, mentioned. Hillsborough Plantation, which is East Oak Forest, West Oak Forest, and next to Ashleyville, Maryville area. That was the Hill family that established Hillsborough Plantation. And that name has been on the landscape, for almost 300 years, well, at least 300 years. So that's a possibility too. And everybody knows if you live in the Low Country long enough, if you find a high spot that doesn't flood, you camp out on it.
And you call it a hill.
It don't flood. That's good.
I like Mary's comment in the chat. If we can have a Mount Pleasant, why not a hill? Diane, are you able to share the Amazon link?
You're muted, Diane.
You're muted.
I'm trying to be polite. I don't know how to do that, but I'm sending my email address. So if you email me, I'll be able to send you the link to the book company as well as Amazon. Thank you.
I do know the book company is called Book Baby. So I think if you just went to bookbaby.com and Google her title, it might come up to buy directly.
That is correct. You're right. Yes.
That's how I already bought my copy. Get on the list, folks. It's
Thank
a good
you
book.
so much.
That's great. Did anybody else, and our last event, we had a Zoom bomber, so I got a little nervous, but I feel like so far things are really great. So feel free to speak up and ask a question too and unmute yourself to do it. You don't have to do it in the chat if you don't want to.
I'll have to say, I apologize for spamming the chat. I'm fighting a toddler and I'm in tech anyway, but this is my first event like this, and with Charleston Moves anyway. And I'm a huge history nerd and I live in Moreland. So this has been amazing. And I texted my whole neighborhood group and I'm going to send them out the link. I'm going to be like, you guys have to watch this, it's fantastic. Like, I appreciate it. I literally, again, I apologize.
Well, Moreland,
thank you.
Moreland is Pleasure Grove. That's what.
I knew it. See, hubby, I was telling him. All right. Thank you guys. No, I really appreciate that. This is fantastic.
Thank you. Anybody else have any burning questions for our experts? Y'all covered it all. Hopefully we can do, every year, Nick is always so gracious to do a history lecture for us that's themed. And I'm hoping later this year, we'll be able to maybe do some more Mobility Month Redux events. And maybe we can convince our historians to do another one, because there's just so much that y'all didn't even get to cover that is fascinating. So with that,
Katie, you mentioned that I've got this podcast blog called The Charleston Time Machine, and I did a program a couple of years ago about biking over the Ashley River Bridge. And it was something that grew out of a conversation that we had. And I just sat down and typed that thing up really quickly and put it online. And so there's the audio and the text version. I'm going to refresh it tomorrow morning. So I'm going to try to add some new images and put in a little bit more detail. So kind of an update of that historical picture of biking across the Ashley River Bridge in the late 1890s, which Donna talked a little bit about. And that's something that if you're interested in biking across that bridge and the future of it, that helps to learn about the past. And next week, I have a plan to talk about the antecedents for low country rapid transit. You know, the 12-a-day passenger trains that used to go back and forth between Somerville and Charleston, 12 a day. And we got rid of that in the 1960s.
of course. Yeah.
So there's so many historical precedents for better modes of mobility. We all threw it out the window in favor of the automobile, but there's so many other modes. So we're trying to embrace our multimodal past. How about that?
That's right. And we'll make sure we'll get those links from you so that we send the recording out and all of the good info with it. We'll make sure to let people know you've updated that, and they should check that out.
Yeah.
Well, with that being said, thank you all so much. This and Nick, Donna, Diane, Charlie, thank you all so much for taking your time to do this. Savannah and I both really appreciate it. I know the community appreciates it, and I always learn at least 30 new things when I talk to y'all. So it's good.
Enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. We
Thank
enjoyed it.
And
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Right.
Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye.